So there we go. Here's the topic, the art and science of botanical tincturing. I call it art and science because it really is art and science. You know what I mean? Like a lot of the stuff that we do, menstruum composition, extraction ratios, all the things, it's very scientific. There's some measuring. We even have like the dilution equation and the concentration equation. But the art of it is, it's a lot of this is really, you learn it by doing, right? It's hands-on stuff. And, in the class where we put together, we're like trying to show people exactly how much pressure we're using to pack a cone. And it's like, you kind of have to feel that. You know what I mean?
And observe so you can see that the material that you're packing down is nice and smushed and there aren't any holes or channels in it.
It's one of those like you got to be there and do it kind of practice things, but we've tried to verbalize and visualize it as much as possible and make handouts and all the things, but it really is an art. You develop it with practice. It's like one of those tactile skill sets, and also organoleptic. You use your organoleptics, your senses, to evaluate what you have made and be like, oh, this is really good. And so anyway, you lose a little bit by being online, but y'all have apothecaries and things you can tincture. So here's the topics we're going to go over. There's Kat. Looking very enthusiastic, and what the heck is that thing? That's the new
dropping funnel.
It's called a dropping funnel. That's what we're using now for percolation cones of all things. So we'll get to that. An open top dropping funnel.
Yes, they're pretty awesome.
They are.
I love it.
Me too. Okay, so solubility and extraction. Some of you have taken the solubility and extraction class that we did, and we've learned principles of solubility and extraction that apply to tincture making, is what we're going to talk just a little bit about tonight, right? So also menstruum math and a menstruum math calculator. Oh boy, do we have a fun thing that we put together, and our friend, the Excel wizard, started it. So yeah, Evelina. So menstruum math and a menstruum math calculator. What this is about is dried herbs and fresh herbs, right? You actually do the menstruum differently for those different ones. And then you can apply that to all these different kinds of extraction that we're doing, or tincture making methods, right? So we'll look at that a little bit, talk about how you can kind of dial in that maceration, the classic maceration herb in a jar game. There are some things that you can do, even if you aren't doing percolations or anything else. You can make your macerations more consistent and more concentrated by doing certain of these factors that affect extraction that we're going to go over, right? We'll also talk about fresh herb tinctures, all that water in there, a surprising amount of water. If you haven't ever done this before, when somebody introduced me to how much water is actually in fresh herbs, I thought they were like wrong.
I was like, they maybe overestimated water content.
Yes. I was like, really? Yeah. There's that much? So there's a lot. We're going to talk about it, and you have to account for that when you're tincturing fresh herbs, because that water is going to be pulled out of the plant and added to the tincture. So it's like a different set of calculations that you do if you're working with fresh herbs. True. Yeah. Okay, fresh herb tinctures. And what is this? Rapid Vitamix method. This is the, I used to say, you can make a great tincture in 20 minutes, but now I'm more like 30 minutes.
Yes.
If you're really wacky, maybe 20 minutes. But when I learned this, that was a game changer. So we'll talk about a little bit about that. Like actually tincturing in a Vitamix. Fenner didn't have a Vitamix.
No, but he would want one.
I know. Can you imagine if Fenner came from the 1880s and just showed up today? It would be like, I hope he wasn't a jerk. Oh. Fenner for dinner. Okay, so rapid Vitamix method, we're going to talk about that and the factors that make that really good for tincturing quickly, because it specializes in some of these things that affect extraction. And that's actually a kind of what I call power maceration. right? So sometimes we think, oh, the maceration is going to take 6 weeks, but actually, you can do a power maceration in a Vitamix in 30 minutes.
Time saver.
Time saver. And sometimes you need a tincture really quickly too, right? And well, now you can do that because we have electrical kitchen appliances. But there are also some other machines, like affordable home machines. Sometimes I call them heated extractors or programmable extractors. And you can also use those to make a power maceration. So we'll show you some pictures and talk about that a little bit. And then a little bit about percolation too, which is the other big tincture making method. Some of y'all have maybe done percolations. The classic percolation, we didn't bring the green bottle to wave around, but we have a picture of it, is what I call the SWSBM style percolation. And that stands for Southwest School of Botanical Medicine, the legendary Michael Moore and Donna Chesner school that was down there in Bisbee, Arizona. I guess it was in a few places, but when I first encountered it,
Cool.
it was down in Bisbee. What a town. So yeah, sometimes I call this Michael Moore percolation. And that's a percolation that a lot of us have done with a classic green bottle, right? The green
Yes.
Pellegrino bottle, or what's that other bottle called?
Perrier?
Perrier bottle. Yeah, with the bottom cut off. And that is just such a genius way to do percolation. We really got into that recently. And it's genius because it takes this really complex set of instructions and practices and makes them super accessible and super affordable without like dumbing it down. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It is really a brilliant thing. And Michael Moore invented that. Donna told me that he first taught it at Brighton Bush in like the 80s or something, like 70s maybe. She thought it
Nice.
was maybe in the 80s. Yeah, so what he did is he studied the old herbal pharmacists, like Thinner and Remington's practice of pharmacy and all that stuff. And he, thought it over, and he's like, how can I make this workable for herbalists? So the interesting thing about that is there's so many interesting things about that, but you can go on the internet and do like percolation, herbs, and tincturing and see all these people teaching the green bottle method now, and they don't even know where it came from. They just like learned it from somebody who learned it from somebody who learned it, who learned it. And so I like to give, credit to our elder Michael Moore and
Thank
Donna
you,
Chesner for inventing
Michael.
that, because it's a super accessible, and you don't need electricity, you don't need fancy equipment, anybody can do it, so that's cool. But we also nerded out further beyond the Michael Moore method, and we went back to those historical pharmacy methods, figured out what they were talking about and what they were doing. And they were doing some interesting and different stuff than I ever, learned. I learned the Michael Moore green bottle method from Mary Barnes, actually, if anybody knows Mary Barnes. And then Lynn and I taught this. Didn't we teach this at CSCH back in the day? Yeah. So Lynn knows about this. But he was doing a few things very differently than what they were doing. But the tincture came out really, really good. It was just, I still, every time I talk about it, I'm like, that was brilliant. He was quite the brilliant character, that fellow. Okay, so that's sort of the outline of what we're looking at tonight. Tincture topics. Oh, isn't that beautiful? We have a lot of ginger tincture now because we did a lot of experiments. What we did was we tried to make a bunch of different extraction methods with ginger, because we had a lot of dried ginger and fresh ginger, because it's winter. It's like fresh herbs, where can we get them? Let's do ginger. So we have all these ones to compare, right? So we made them as close to each other as possible, but using the different methods to see how the different methods would bring different personalities and different characters out of that ginger. And it is really pretty interesting what happened. At the end, we'll show you, we'll do some tastings. So what exactly is tincturing, right? Tincturing is making a hydroethanolic extraction. I probably wrote that somewhere, but hydroethanolic means
Water and ethanol
water
in
and
varying
ethanol.
percentages.
Yeah, in varying proportions. And you can also include, some with some plants specialized, you might want to use vinegar instead of water, like lobelia or something.
Mhm.
Or you might want to include some glycerin instead of some water with certain extractions. But for the most part, we're talking about hydroethanolic extraction. And the reason it's called extraction is because your menstruum, or your hydroethanolic solvent system, as we call it, is reaching into that plant material and pulling constituents out. It's extracting that plant material. So in chemistry world, instead of tincturing, we would say, oh, we're making a hydroethanolic extraction. A maceration, a percolation, whatever. So we're extracting those soluble constituents from the herbs, the constituents that are soluble in our particular menstruum that we're making, right? Which, and I'll show you more about that, and it's a variable thing. But yeah, that's one of those. I think that one is sitting right here. That's our fresh ginger classical maceration there. And do you remember what that was?
That's also a fresh.
Yeah, is that a fresh one? And look at
That's
the,
the fresh Vitamix.
oh, that's the one we made in the Vitamix.
Mhm.
This one right here. Oh yeah,
Yes.
and we got all that plant cell wall material that settled out of it. Yeah, that was a good extraction. All right, so what is the different menstrua, right? This is a really brief review of polarity. This is some of the solubility and extraction. What's behind making these different menstrua? Why do we make 40%, 30%, 80%, 90%, whatever we're making our menstruum? Why are we doing that? Why are we varying the ethanol percentage in our menstruum, right? So this is why. This explains why. The main factor that determines the solubility of any constituent is this electromagnetic characteristic of the constituent of the molecule, and it's called polarity, right? And I don't have time to explain that in this webinar, but just it's in the book, it's in a different class, there are things, but polarity is like the main factor. And what we're doing is we're matching the polarity of the menstruum or the solvent to the polarity of the constituents that we are wanting to pull out of there, right? So we're matching the menstruum to the constituents based on this chemical characteristic called polarity, right? And if you get that just right, you get optimal extraction of those constituents that you've polarity matched with your menstruum and your solvent.
Yes, and some herbs have a wide range of different herbal constituents that would come out of a higher polarity solvent versus a lower. So
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
tailor it.
So right there, exactly. So if you see people using different percent in their menstruum to extract the same herb, it doesn't mean this one's right and that one's wrong. It means they're focusing on pulling different sets of constituents out of that herb. And all of a sudden, instead of one herb, you've got like a whole range of possibilities in that one herb, which is really, really interesting stuff. So, so we're matching the polarity of the menstruum of the solvent to the constituents we want to extract. And here's the principle: like dissolves like, or like extracts like. And that means solvents with a certain polarity will extract constituents with a similar polarity, right? Yay. And the other important thing to think about, there's so many, is that polarity and solubility are all spectra, right? They're ranges, they're continuum, they're not absolutes. So the question becomes like this: how polar is it? How soluble is this constituent in the solvent, right? So, because a lot of times we'll go, oh, we'll say things like, that herb is water soluble, and I'll be like, which constituents in that herb are you talking about? Because there are hundreds, thousands, and their solubilities and polarities are all over the place. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's not an herb that's soluble, it's constituents that are soluble, right? Number one. And number two, that solubility is a spectrum, right? It's not either or. It's not water soluble versus not water soluble, right? It's a spectrum. It's how soluble is it coming out of this herb in this water at this temperature, blah, 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 right? There's no either or.
That's life.
In nature. I mean, nature doesn't do that. It's all spectra. It's all like ranges, right? Yeah. So we're not going to go into this, but I wanted to put this here. And you're going to get a recording of this so you can look at it again and do however you save things. So this is kind of lining up higher polarity or more water soluble constituents over here in groups and lower polarity constituents over here in groups. And just realize that, you know, if I did something like, I'm going to make it go away so we don't worry about it too much. And let me just cancel that sentence I started and let's look at this, right? So our menstruum, I love that word, plural menstrua. You walk around saying that, oh, are the menstrua completed yet? Menstruum, hydro, water, ethanolic, right? Solvent system, like we said, example, when we say our menstruum is 75%, we mean it's 75% ethanol and 25% water. A lot of people don't think about that water like that, you know? So solvents that we use, ethanol, glycerin, and water, right? These are the relative polarities of those. Water is super highly polar. So we give it a 100, pass the test. Glycerin compared to water is 81 and ethanol is 65. So what that shows you is there's quite a spread between the polarity of ethanol and water. And it also shows you that glycerin is really similar to water. It's pretty close to water. All three of those things we know will mix together, right? Yes. If you tried to pour some oil, some olive oil in there, it wouldn't mix, right? Because the polarity of olive oil is super close to 0. It's very low, right? So that's why we don't tincture with olive oil. You know, hydro, oleo, ethanolic solvents don't exist in our world. So anyway, so what we're doing is we're varying the polarity of the menstruum depending on the percents of ethanol and water and maybe glycerin that we put together in our menstruum. That's what we're doing. We're adjusting the polarity of that menstruum, right? And the more ethanol you have in your system, your solvent system, your menstruum, the lower the overall polarity of it is going to be. So if you think about that for a second, a lot of you probably learned to extract resinous herbs, you use high percent ethanol, right? Which means we're using a low polarity solvent to go after low polarity constituents because resins are low polarity.
Yep.
Right. And a lot of you have also learned that if you're if you use a low ethanol menstruum, that means you're using a high water menstruum, right? Because the other part of it is water. And that means since water is highly polar, you have a higher polarity menstruum and you go after higher polarity constituents, right? And you can even do something like get some polysaccharides or some mucilage in your tincture that way, right? So those are kind of two extremes on that spectrum there.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're varying the polarity of our menstruum by adjusting the ethanol percent. That's what we're doing. Yay.
Very cool.
Yay, chemistry. Okay, so polarity of menstruum. So that is the biggest factor that affects extraction. Actually, is the polarity. That's why we want to match that menstruum. Because if you're way off with that, you're not going to get the constituents you want out of the herb. Or you're not going to get the kind of tincture you want to make out of that herb. Right?
True.
So these other things, there's a lot of factors that affect extraction, but polarity is the big one. Yes. You know, so if you don't have that close enough, it's not going to work very well. Like if you tried to extract myrrh with, you know, 10% ethanol, 90% water, you wouldn't get a very concentrated tincture of myrrh.
Yeah.
Right.
Or maybe hibiscus with some oil versus hibiscus with water.
Yeah, because those beautiful red constituents in hibiscus are water soluble. And if you tried to extract it with oil, you wouldn't get much red out. Right. So the polarity is the #1 factor. And that's why we bother learning about that in detail. Yeah. But another thing that really affects extraction a lot, and this applies to tincture making actually, is the heat, the temperature. Right. Most of us make tinctures at room temperature. Right.
Yes.
But you can warm them, and the old timers did. They had Fenner invented a thing called the water bath percolator.
All right, Fenner.
Yeah, and he patented it. And apparently it was hot stuff. And it was a percolation cone inside a circulating warm water bath to like actually warm it. And John Uri Lloyd, who was a famous eclectic pharmacist, he invented some crazy machines for extracting herbs. Like I've seen some of them at the Lloyd Library, and you're just like, what? And so you can use heat. And why would you want to use heat with tincturing in certain circumstances is because it accelerates extraction. It enhances extraction. That's the general rule. And it can make a big difference. Where you see this even more is if you're making water infusions, say, or
Right.
decoctions. It's like, do we make our infusions with cold water? Not usually, unless it's marshmallow or something, right? We use hot water because heat penetrates those plant cell walls, helps break them open, release the constituents, and it makes a stronger tea or, infusion or whatever, right? So temperature is a really important factor too. And we actually learned how to apply that in some cases with our programmed extractors. And they have heat settings. We've been playing with that. You're like, heating tinctures, what? But there's a way to do it safely. Yeah. And it made some pretty amazing results, I gotta say.
Quickly too.
Yeah, quickly. So we think about polarity, then we think about temperature. Agitation is another one. It's called agitation. That means, yes, basically that. Right? It's the shaking the tincture. The more you agitate it, the more quickly it extracts and the more thoroughly, right? And the machine that is really the best at that is the Vitamix. That's why the Vitamix makes amazing tinctures so fast, because it's extreme agitation, like thousands of RPM in those whirling power blades, right? It's just like the ultimate, you can think of like a million little hands shaking a million little jars really fast, That's so agitation really does, enhance extraction also.
Yes, it does.
It does. And then time is a big factor, right? When I first learned to make tinctures, they were like 6 weeks. Wise woman's tradition, 6 weeks. And I was like, okay, sometimes you don't want to wait 6 weeks though, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but you don't have to wait 6 weeks. I know, 30 minutes. And also when we think about time, it's like, it kind of applies to a lot of these other things, because it's like, how long do you do this process for? What we're looking at right now, y'all, is process-based medicine making, right? It's not, recipe-based medicine making. It's like you think about what you're doing, and then you learn why you're doing it, and then you learn, how can I like monkey with that factor to get what I want, to make it better, to make it stronger, to make it more concentrated, to make it more consistent, etc. So it's like process-based thinking, right? What are the processes doing? So the cool thing with time is you can apply it, right, to the process. It's like, how long do you heat it for? How long do you macerate it for? How long do you agitate it for? How long are you applying the other things to it? And so you can do things to like make that shorter if you want, which is pretty interesting process. And then we have surface area. Hey, and I love this word, comminution. It means chopping things up, breaking things up, making them smaller. In other words, increasing the surface area, right? That's the old biology joke. If you don't know the answer to the question, just go increases surface area, right? Because, the ultimate surface area is a powder, a fine powder, right?
Yes.
And why would you want to do that? Why would you want to make a fine powder?
To break down the matrix so that we can
Yeah.
release the herbal constituents.
Yeah, the more you break down that plant matrix, those cell walls, those cell wall materials, then the solvent or the menstruum can get in there, penetrate, and just pull everything out. Yeah. And what did we do? We did 2 of these tinctures, the ginger it was dried ginger, classic maceration in a jar. One of them we powdered, the other we did cut and sifted. And we just sat there and watched the powdered one just like, whew, remember that?
Yes.
It just colored up so fast. And we're like, wow. And then now that they've been sitting for how long, like a month, 6 weeks or something, they're the same color now. Eventually it extracted, but the powdered one was much faster because surface area.
Yes.
Yeah, that was cool to watch that happen. Another factor that might influence your extractions is pressure, right? So magic in a mason jar. I love when I learned this. It's like doing something in a mason jar actually pressurizes it a little bit. And some of these extractors can add a little bit of pressure too, right? Because they're closed tightly. And pressure just like kind of squeezes constituents out of plant cells, so that has a little bit of effect. And in some extraction schemes, it can have a lot more of an effect. That's like, this isn't tinctures, but if you pour the hot water in the mason jar with the tea and then you crank the lid down and you go to shake it and it goes, right? You're like, oh, there's a lot of pressure in there. PV equals nRT, nerds. So yeah, so that increases the extraction, right? Sometimes pH is a factor, not always, not necessarily, unless you're using, if you're using vinegar, say, instead of water, that comes into play. But with some other kinds of, making vinegars or oxymels or whatever, that can become more significant. pH, alkalinity, acidity, etc. And finally, we have the plant matrix effects, right, which are really huge. And to me, that means every plant is unique, right? It holds on to its constituents or releases its constituents a little differently based on its structure, particular things about its cells and its toughness or fluffiness or lightness or whatever. It's not always the same, right? Like you can plan an extraction, a tincture, any kind of tincture of an herb, right, based on what you think it's going to do, but it might behave a little differently than a similar herb. It might be easier to extract, quicker to extract, harder to extract, or if you're doing percolations, you really get into some of those matrix effects because you're like, why is it dripping so slow? I did it just like this other herb, so that can be a really significant factor too.
Absolutely. And even a single plant can have different matrix from the aerial part to the roots, of course.
Yeah.
So,
or even depending on growing conditions, it can be different because a plant will build its body structure differently. So there's a lot of variation in there, and that's part of that art again, right? Making a menstruum. So, in a short webinar, we don't have tons of time to go through this, but there are some interesting tricks I wanted to share with you about making menstruum and what we use. Some of you probably use the dilution equation already, but when I learned this, it was like major game changer, because before I knew about the dilution equation and how to do this for dry herbs, right, especially, I was like, okay, I have 100 mils of menstruum I need to make. I want it to be 40% ethanol. So what I'm going to do is get 40 mils of ethanol and put it together with 60 mils of water, and I'm going to put them in there. And then it's like, why is it less than 100 mils?
hydrogen bonding.
So this is one thing that goes on. Yeah, that's not necessarily how the old pharmacists made menstruum, right? When she's saying hydrogen bonding, what's happening is when you put ethanol and water in together, those molecules are like attracted to each other and they squeeze up and the volume of your liquid shrinks. And depending on conditions, it's not even a linear phenomenon. Depending on temperature and a bunch of other weird stuff, it can shrink by about 2 to 3%, and sometimes more. I was looking at crazy graphs about this because I was like, give me a number that I can share with people on this. And it was like between 2 and 4%, depending on conditions and blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on when you put ethanol and water in together, right? And another thing is, what I learned before I knew about this was if you've got some 95% ethanol, which is like Everclear or pure cane ethanol or whatever, it's not 100% ethanol, it's 95.
5% water.
It's 5% water. And a lot of us would just kind of be like, oh yeah, that's, we'll just pretend it's 100. That's what I used to do. But we'll just pretend it's 100% to make our menstruum calculations easier. But now, I care about that 5%. So using this easy equation, it's not even algebraic. It's a really simple equation. You can accurately calculate your menstruum, right? And then you can learn how to mix it so that it comes out just right. which is really, really cool. So that's what you see some of that dilution equation stuff going on in the background there. Did I write it up here? I did. Get out your notes, students. Okay, so this dilution equation, it's like what you can do, and why it's called dilution is you start with something that's higher percent ethanol, and you can make any lower percent ethanol menstruum out of it. Right? So if you're starting with 95%, awesome, but you don't have to. Like say, if I wanted to make I probably, here, let's follow the example on the slides. Example, you have some cane alcohol. It's 95% ethanol, 5% water, right? And what you want to make for your tincturing project is 300 mils of 60%, right? How do you do it? With the magical constant dilution equation, right? Because you're diluting that 95% with some water to create your 60%. And you're creating exactly how much you want, which is another cool thing about this equation, right? So you don't have to end up making an unknown amount or whatever. So this is how it works. It goes concentration 1, that's 95 for 95%, right? We wrote it down here, times volume 1, that is how much of this Everclear am I going to need, right?
Yes.
That's V1, volume 1, and that's what you're finding out by using this equation. That's the unknown, right? So you know what your concentration is, but you don't know how much you're going to have to use, but you know what you want to make. This is what we want to make. The 60 is the 60% menstruum that we want to make. The 300 is the 300 mils of it that we want to make.
That's our
right?
final volume. Yep.
Yeah, our final volume that we want to make. So you just take 60 times 300 and you divide it by 95 and you get the magic number, 189.5. What is that telling you is you need 189.5 mils of your Everclear, whatever you're using, your cane ethanol, to make this menstruum that you want, right? So how you mix it is you have a graduated cylinder, right? I love those things. They're cool, and they're also called graduated, which makes me feel good. And you put your ethanol or your cane alcohol, your Everclear or whatever, into the graduated cylinder. You put it in first, right? And you put exactly this much, and then you add enough water to bring it up to the 300 milliliter mark. You can see my hand, right?
Yes.
So you don't even have to measure your water. I mean, you can tell about how much water you're going to need by taking your final menstruum volume and subtracting the amount of 95% ethanol you're going to put in there. And that's going to tell you almost how much water you need. But they're going to shrink a little when you put them together, right? So first you put your ethanol in that cylinder and then you bring it up to the 300 mils.
Ding, your menstruum is
Ding,
made.
your menstruum is made. Now, some of y'all out there might be going, yeah, but aren't you diluting it a tiny bit because it shrinks, but then you're adding a little bit more water? And the answer to that is yes. And it's really interesting to read in the old time books about what they did with this, because they're like, yeah, if you wanted to be perfectly accurate with this menstruum, what you would do would be weigh your ethanol and weigh your water and combine them by weight. And then like they did it in a more complicated way, say in a big drug manufacturing house of the day, drug meant herb back then, right? But they go, but for all practical purposes, nobody really does this because the pharmacists of those days, just like every corner pharmacy, they would have a row of percolation cones and macerations, and they would get a script from the doctor and they would mix the medicine, and they would make it and mix it and give it to you, right? So all these old pharmacy manuals were like, yeah, nobody really does that. What we do is what we just told you. So this is a historical method, and you just accept that little bit of error, right? That it's going to be a little less than the 60%, just by a little bit. And the more of it you make, the smaller the error is going to be, and sometimes, you can also like fudge around with it and squirt a little bit of ethanol in at the end there too. Like I figured out exactly how much in one of these crazy calculations I did just for fun late at night. But that's how the pharmacist did it, and that's how Most of us do it. And you're just like, oh, it's a little under 60%. You know, there's other ways too. But so that the cool thing about the dilution equation, let me see what my next slide is here. Fisher Benstrom is it not only works for 95%, right? Like if I had some, and we just did this in the lab recently. I pick up, I'm like, wow, our 95% is getting low. What else can I use? Look around, and I had this bottle. Yeah, I had this bottle of that was one of the things. But another thing was I had a bottle of 65%, and I wanted to make 45%. And I'm like, oh, I can do that with the dilution equation,
Yes.
right? Because I'm diluting. So I put 65 here instead of 95, right? And I put 45 over here because that's what I wanted to end up with. And however many mils I was making at the time, I don't remember what it was, but it works just the same. It tells you how much of that 65% to use. And then you put it in the cylinder and bring it up with water, and you end up with 45%. So it gives you a lot of powers to use the dilution equation. We also programmed it into the calculator in case math isn't your favorite game. Yeah, so you can do that with dried herbs. With fresh herb menstruum, it's a more complex set of calculations. So we're not really going to go over it here because we don't have time, but I wanted to show you it exists, right? Because what you have to do with fresh herbs is you have to consider the amount of water that menstruum and your method is going to pull out of the herbs, because that water is going to add itself to your menstruum.
Yes, it is.
Yes,
which will change its polarity.
Which will change its polarity. It will. And it'll also drop your ethanol content. If you try to, so this is such an interesting thing, right? And I love the way Michael Moore worked around this too. And so let me show you how, what that was one of the worksheets that we developed to go with our class. It's a like 2-page worksheet. It's like step by step. It's really funny because the process is kind of counterintuitive at first of making a fresh herb message. Like, why am I adding this to that? I don't understand this. But after you practice it for a while, it starts clicking, and you're like, oh yeah, I get that, right? So it is a little bit more complex to do the calculations, because that water, as it's extracting, as it's tincturing, it's going to like ooze out and add itself to the menstruum. That water is really attracted to the ethanol in your menstruum, right? So it's going to come out. So when you're tincturing a fresh herb, the first step of that process is you determine the water content of it. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. You dry a sample, you see how much water it lost. You know, conveniently 1 gram of water weighs 1 milliliter for practical purposes. So you can figure out, oh, how much actual liquid water is in that plant that's going to come out and jump into the menstruum, right? So if you're making herbs for the marketplace or whatever, you want to do that test and figure out how much water is in your herb. But if you don't have time, or you don't feel like doing that, or you don't need to do it, the average water content of that herb is 75%. Isn't that wacky? And the range is from, I don't know, I couldn't believe that at first. I'm like, really?
Yeah.
How can I, I've got some peppermint leaf. It's like 75. Sometimes it's a lot more. It's, the range is about 60 to 80%-ish. Even with roots and stuff, there's a lot of water in there.
Even stone root?
Even stone root. I don't know what the water content is. Yeah, that could be one of those drier sorts of roots. I mean, when you think about the human body is like 70-ish% water, and we seem pretty solid. So I guess that's not so wacky, right? But you want to know the water content when you're figuring out your menstruum, right? And this applies to fresh herbs no matter what method you're using. So if you're doing them in a jar, if you're doing them in a Vitamix, if you're doing them in a magical butter machine or an STX infusium, which is those infusers that you can buy, you make the menstruum the same way. So you got to figure out how much of that plant water is in there. And then there's a series of calculations that you do, and it's like, I can't even go into it right now, but it's not that they're hard. It's just that it's a process. And we also put that in the calculator, right? And what you end up doing is adding less water than you would from the outside, because you figure out how much water is coming out of however much plant material you're using. It's a really interesting process. Yeah. So before I learned about this, I did the Michael Moore, like, intelligent cheat method, which was use 95% ethanol for all your fresh herbs. Right? Because it comes out pretty close in most cases, So if you don't learn about this and want to go through all the extra stuff you have to do to figure out that plant water adding itself to your menstruum, right? Then you can just be like, oh, 95%. And there's a lot of herbalists that do that. And it usually turns out pretty good. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Another one of those brilliant Michael Moore distillations.
Yay, Michael.
Yeah. And so here's an example of this. Oh God, time goes so fast. I just want to talk about everything all the time. But I used to tincture fresh elderberries, and I'd be like, oh, I'll just use like 50%, because 50% gets anthocyanins out, the purple stuff in elderberries. It's really like part of their viral, discouraging powers. I'll just do it 50% because anthocyanins like 50%. And what was the ethanol percent of my actual finished elderberry tincture? I think it was even less than 20%.
Oh, so you wouldn't be able to preserve it as well.
Exactly, preservation, right? You have to have at least 20%. I prefer 25%, right? But those are juicy entities. Those were probably 90% water, right? And I did not end up with a 50% tincture. I ended up with considerably less. I thought, oh, it'll be 25% because they're half water, whatever. But no. So that's where this kind of thing can get really significant. If you have an especially juicy material that you want to tincture, you really need to know how much water is coming out of there, right? Because it's not going to be what you start with. Nope. If you just start with a 50% menstruum. Yeah. La, 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 la. Math is magic. That's why we programmed the menstruum math calculator, which is part of this new class that's about to open. In fact, it's opening tonight, right? Which is super cool. You just plug some numbers in. I want this, and I want this much of it. And I want it to be 1 to 2 or whatever. And it goes, this is how much to add to your fresher menstruum. Oh. Yeah. If math isn't your favorite game, automate it. That's my new saying. That's my other bumper sticker. Bumper sticker world. There's Rosie telling us we can do it with menstruum math. So you can learn how to do, you don't need a calculator to do this, right? And we actually teach people, we have like step-by-step worksheets, we work through it. We even do the concentration equation. That one's fun because it's algebra. Yeah, but here's the kinds of things you can do when you learn this sort of thing, right? You can dilute any menstruum to make any lower ethanol percent menstruum out of it. So we kind of went over that in detail as an example. Dilution equation. Did you know you can concentrate a menstruum? You can concentrate a menstruum to make a higher ethanol percent, right? As long as you don't want to go crazy way higher. But if you have some 40% and you're like, I've got 40%, I need 50% for this project. And I only have this much, this much Everclear, 95%, cane alcohol or whatever. I don't want to dilute all of that to make this stuff. What can I do? Oh, the concentration equation, right? It's a little complicated because you think about this, when you're concentrating a menstruum, you're adding more ethanol, but you're also adding a little bit more water, and you're also increasing the volume of it, right? Yep. That's why it gets complicated and you need algebra for it.
Yay, algebra.
Yay, algebra. Okay, yeah, that's one reason why you might want a calculator. Another thing you can do with this, I love this. I just did this recently too. If you can mix 2 menstrua together to get a new menstruum with an ethanol percent somewhere in between the two, right? So if you look around, you're like, oh, I don't have enough of this. I'm like, what have I got here? Okay, I've got some 40%. I've got some 75%. I need 60%. You can do it. There's a calculation. It's actually one of the, it's not as difficult as the concentration thing, but you know exactly how much of this one to put together with how much of this one to end up with what you want in the middle. Yay. Yeah, pretty cool, huh?
Yes.
So there's a lot. All these things I always wondered if you could do it. Now we know. We know how you can do it, right? And then this is what we were just talking about. You can make a menstruum for fresh herbs that takes into account the amount of water in the herb and ends up being the right ethanol percent at the end when it's finished, right? And it ends up going after the right constituents that you want in that fresh herb, okay? Instead of being more dilute than you intended it. Why is that thing there in our face?
You highlighted that. There you go.
Oh. And you can make exactly the right amount of menstruum you need to use with any extraction method for fresh herbs, for dried herbs. Yeah, you get the powers. You get the powers because math is magic and so is chemistry. This is what it looks like in our laboratory. No kidding, for real. We have magic rainbows. You know, so I put this in here because a lot of people are like, oh, math's a pain in the ass, I don't like math. It's just because you had awful math teachers. Like, math isn't actually hard, it's just taught to be hard. You know what I mean?
Math trauma.
Like, math trauma is a thing, dude. And it's like the education system, you know, there are ways to make it easier. So don't be scared of doing math with herbal medicine. Yeah, you can actually turn it into fun and magic. And I literally do think math is magic. I think magic is real, and so is chemistry, and they're both math and they're both magic. That's the way I look at it. And molecules are plant spirits. So that brings us to methods of extraction. Look at this. I think this webinar is going to be a little long. Our webinars are always longer than we say they're going to be.
That's all right.
Can't help it, right? So there's all these different methods of extraction. There's a classical Michael Moore bottle in the jar. You know what else is brilliant about that? This is the lab stand. The mason jar becomes the lab stand and the collector vessel.
Multi-tool.
Multitask, and it's a mason jar. You get it for $1, you know. Love that. So there's classical maceration. You can do fresh herbs in a jar, dried herbs in a jar. And the old-time pharmacists had some specific instructions for maceration too. It's really interesting. Yeah. You can do power maceration, right? For fresh herbs or dried herbs. I learned to do fresh herbs in a Vitamix first, and then I'm like, why not dried herbs? So I started experimenting with that. Works great. Yeah. So you can do them, you know, with the Vitamix, the electrical infuser or the programmable infuser. I keep changing what I call these things, the heated infusers, whatever. We'll see pictures of them. You can do those as well. They make some really good tincture. Very interesting. You can do percolation, right? Which is where the solvent moves down through the column. It's like column chromatography, only different. You can do it with dried herbs. You know what's really interesting in the old books? They had some recipes for percolating fresh herbs.
Okay.
I want to try that. I haven't tried that, but like, I'm like, whoa. And they also had some recipes for percolating with water.
Just water.
And they also had some recipes with 16 for like first do the water, then do the alcohol, or the other way around. They got, yeah, there's some serious arts going on back then.
Sounds like fine tuning.
I know, right? So, but for our purposes, we're going to talk about percolating with dried herbs, right? Because that's kind of the easy way to do it. I remember when I first heard about this, I was kind of like, you're supposed to tincture herbs fresh, because that's what I learned, you know. And then I was like, there are other ways to do things, right? So this is the Southwest School of Botanical Medicine. God, what a legendary entity. Percolation for the people. I made that up, but it really is. It's the accessible kind of percolation. So that was developed by Michael Moore. He came up with it, and Donna Chestner, and she was the main percolations teacher at the school. She told me, actually, she's done like many percolations, yeah, with this method. And then we have the historical and the kind of modernized historical methods that we've gotten into, right? So classical maceration in a jar, fresh and dried herbs. Look at that. Look how dark that is with a powder. Look at the darkness of that. This is fresh herb, right? Fresh ginger. The tincture is much lighter. You want to pull that thing out? We're gonna, yeah.
I think I agitated it, so it's a little bit.
It's a little cloudy now.
Yeah.
You agitate. It's aggro now. Let's take a sample of it.
Let's
as
do
we're
it.
talking. Yeah, fresh and dried comes out so interestingly different. And the method that you use, they come out really interestingly different too. I mean, you'd think it's the same herb, the same concentration, whatever, it wouldn't be as different as it is. The method makes a lot of difference about what kind of constituents it pulls out and the concentration of them that it pulls out, right? So let's just try it again and see if it's still as amazing as it used to be. Look at that. Will I be able to talk? Don't take too much, right? Organoleptics. This is what we do late at night in the lab.
It's fun.
Ready?
Let's go.
Oh, it's still delicious.
It's warm.
It's warm. It's aromatic. I just got like a
calming.
hot flash on my face. It's super. Is that a thing? Facial hot flashes.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's very diffusive. It's very ascending. It's very, very delicious.
It almost has a buzz in my tongue, the esophagus. Now my stomach is warm. There's that
super penetrating.
It's calming for me.
Yeah.
And warming.
So good.
Like a nice fire in the winter.
Fire in the hole. Yeah. It's definitely with the fresh ginger maceration, it is the tastier version that it brings out those aromatics more. That kind of makes sense, as fresh herbs have more aromatics than dried herbs, you know, because some of the aromatics have disappeared with the dried herbs.
Yeah, when I
evaporated.
When I opened the fresh ginger jar to pour the sample, I could smell it right away. So.
Yeah, very penetrating and very dispersing. Oh, that's so good. You know, in Chinese medicine, they say fresh ginger, dried ginger is hotter than fresh ginger. And that's true. And it totally plays out with these different tinctures that we've made. It's so fun to play and experiment. You know what I mean? It's like, I love my job. We get to play with herbs and experiment and learn these things. Let's compare a dried ginger to it as we go along here.
Are we sure? No, I'm just kidding.
Vitamix maceration for fresh or dried herbs. So here it's showing us we're adding the herb into the Vitamix. This is some dried calendula that we did. And you do it in little batches, because if you throw it all in at once, you get powder on the bottom and fluff on the top, right? So we're adding it in little batches, and the menstruum is already in there. We made the menstruum first, and then we're adding the herbs to it. And then we close the lid. We're adding the rest of the menstruum. Some of it was in there. I'm pointing at the screen like you can see my finger. I always do that. So here we're putting it in with, you can see a little bit of menstruum, right? And over here, we're pouring the rest of the menstruum in through the little hole in the lid of the Vitamix. And then we're gonna put the cap on it. Remember that one time we forgot to put the cap?
Powder. Wow. A geyser of powder.
That was a mess.
But fun.
And we're actually like whizzing them up together. So we're breaking up the plant material right inside the menstruum, which is really cool because then it's not oxidizing. You don't have powder everywhere and you're trying to scrape it all in there together. So you're doing your comminution, right? You're increasing the surface area inside there, breaking open the cell walls inside the menstruum. That's what, and you're doing it super fast with all those RPMs, right? That's why it makes such a good, strong tincture inside of Vitamix. But you have to know how to do it for the right amount of time so you don't overheat it. And like, sometimes if you let it go for too long, you get these like mysterious alcohol vapors coming out of the top. It looks very, very witchy, you know? You're like
dry ice.
I know. We should backlight it and make a video.
Cool, here you go.
Yeah, let's try this one.
This is the dry.
Same proportions, well, similar proportions anyway. Okay, I'm scared. Oh, totally different.
It's hot.
Absolutely hotter.
So hot.
Absolutely hotter. Wow. And it's rootier and it's even slightly bitter. Do you taste that bitter?
I can't breathe out. I'm just
Are you okay? Don't have an anaphylactic reaction.
No, it's good.
Yeah, completely different. I mean, very different. Same herb, different extraction methods, dried.
And this one's even a little bit more, it seems bitter.
It does,
versus
you
the
know,
fresh.
this would be super good in a bitters formula. Because you know how you like to add a little aromatic and warm up a bitters formula? This would be so good in a bitters formula if you really wanted to like dig that ginger in.
Your
And I
cheeks are pink.
Am I getting the
Yeah.
face? Oh, but I didn't feel the flash like I felt with a fresh ginger, right? So it's a little bit more grounded, a little bit less diffusive.
Mhm.
I know, it's like, can we still talk? Yeah, super cool. Or super warm.
Super warm.
Right? Look at the color too. I mean, it's beautiful. It looks like, what does it look like?
It looks like a dark amber beer
Yeah,
versus a Pilsner.
versus a Pilsner. The fresh looks like a Pilsner. Yeah, that's interesting, huh? So we made fresh ginger in the Vitamix and we made dried ginger in the Vitamix. So pretty cool. You're maximizing the principle of agitation is what you're doing. And you're using a little bit of heat with it, which is totally fine. It makes the tincture better. You just don't want to go too far. You don't want to over apply your time, right? Because then you'll over apply heat. And also, the one downside with a Vitamix is that you get a lot of very fine particulate material, right? So you have to strain it out somehow, or decant, or do some combination of those things, you know? But everything is like, all the different methods, they're really good at something and they're less good at something else than the other methods. So you have a lot of choices to think about. So, and here's the other way we do power maceration. This is what they call a magical butter machine. And it was designed as a cannabis extractor, right? So it's a consumer thing. It's not super expensive. You can get used ones for really cheap on like Craigslist and stuff because people
eBay,
get
yeah.
bored with them. Yeah, they make great tincturing machines if you know how to use them. And there's another one called an STX Infusium. Do I have a picture? I don't.
That's the
Is that the
STX?
STX? Oh, it
Infusium.
is. Okay, this is the magical butter
Yes.
machine. Yeah. So they can do similar things, except the Infusium, you can set the temperature and the time settings to whatever you want. And it has some presets also. The magical butter has presets, but it doesn't have the whole range. So you can't pick exactly what you want. So they, you know, they're a little different from each other. But the cool thing about the two super cool things about these as extractors is it's a set it and forget it, which I love, right? Because you can do like a million things at once, which is my life. You know, you program it, well, you don't program it, but you choose your settings and you put your plant material in there. You can do fresh, you can do dried, you can use any kind of menstruum you want, right? And it has this stir bar. It's like a stir, it's not a stir bar, it's a, what do you call that?
It's like a blender,
Like an immersion blender blade, right? So it agitates, but it doesn't agitate as much as a Vitamix agitates, right? It's not to the same degree.
That's true.
Yeah, but it's a lot more than you would get by shaking a bottle or a mason jar, right? And it just does it on its own. Sometimes it'll scare you. Like when I first got mine, I was like, whoa, what's that? What's that going off in the lab late at night, you know? But that's one thing you can't control is how often it agitates, but they do a good job, you know? So but the special thing about this is, besides set it and forget it, is you can choose how much heat to use. So this is kind of like a modern substitute for Fenner's water bath percolator in a way, because you don't need the water bath to heat it now. You have an electrical heater. So when you learn how much heat to use for how long with different herbs, you can make some amazing tinctures with these things. Yes. And I got to tell you guys a secret, like we're having a set of tinctures that we made analyzed. So we did percolation, we did magical butter machine, we did Vitamix, and we did it with calendula. And I like secretly wanted the old time percolation to be like the most concentrated, awesome looking, awesome organoleptic tincture. But I think the magical butter machine was actually even better. It's like, no, tradition, you know. But we're gonna find out when we get those results back. But it was like a really concentrated, intense tincture, and it was very characteristic of the herb, You know, it didn't taste like burnt or weird, or it didn't taste like something was wrong with it. It tasted like almost like a fluid extract or something. I was amazed at that. Yeah. So these things for certain applications, it's not, you don't always want a more concentrated tincture.
That's true.
But the cool thing about having a more concentrated tincture is you can dose it lower, right? So if you want to give a person less alcohol, you can dose it lower because it's more herb per unit of alcohol, right? So it can be more efficient, and you can use less menstruum and less herb in the big picture because you've made a more efficient extraction, right?
Yes.
Which also, you know, honors the herb more, because it's like,
Yep.
so you don't want to really dilute tincture in some cases because there's a lot of ethanol and a little bit of herb, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be convenient for a survival or first aid kit, Lobelia, for
Yeah.
example, or
Yeah,
cayenne.
exactly. You get a really concentrated one because you don't want to haul around a lot of extra tincture or whatever, or extra menstruum.
Right.
Yeah, good point. Right. So, and then we have our 2 percolations. Don't worry, I'll still take half an hour of questions. I'm kind of infamous for those. Like, okay, so there's Michael Moore style, right? Percolation for the people with affordable equipment. And here's, you know, the beautiful bottle. It's got its bottom cut off. You pack it with properly ground herbal material, right? A coarse powder. In the old time books, man, they even told you the powder size for the different herbs. Like if you look at an old USP, like 1890 or whatever, it'll be like, grind this herb to a number 40 powder. And you're like, oh, whoa, what? But Mike Moore was like, let's pick the powder size that's going to work for the most herbs, for the most herbalists. So he's like, a coarse powder, you shake it through a metal mesh kitchen strainer, which is about a number 20 powder size. But if you look at those old books, man, they had 20. You can do it. You can even percolate a lot of people think you can't percolate cannabis because it's resinous. You totally can if you have a number 10 powder size and you don't pack it too tight, right? So bigger powder size for more resinous herbs. And even if they had a super resinous herb like myrrh or something, they would mix it with sand and then they would percolate it. Yeah. So there's ways to do things, right? But the number 20, like coarse powder size, that's what Michael taught people how to do. So, and you know, with this kind of percolator, you put a little filter cone in there and start packing it, learn how to pack it very evenly because you want a really even pack so that the menstruum seeps evenly down through, extracting as it goes, you know. And percolations are for the most part, more efficient than macerations, unless you're doing it in a Vitamix or whatever, because that menstruum seeping down through that herb powder just like sucks constituents out as it goes. And then some fresh menstruum comes along behind it, and it's continually fresh menstruum just pulling constituents out and dripping out at the bottom. So this is, do you remember which this one was? This was our dried ginger.
It's ginger.
Yeah, percolation like that. That's a good one. Is that what we just tried?
That is.
Oh, okay. Nom, nom, nom. And this is a funny art picture. I was like, you know, the way I get all the stuff out of the bottom of the cone is I just turn the cone over and go tap, tap, tap. And this cute little, you know, cone of Mark with its little filter hat falls off.
Adorable.
I know. The reason I put this here is an old graduate of CSCH, Lynn's going to remember, Jake. He like, you know, I love synchronicity. Right before this class, he shoots me an email. He's like, hey, I'm making cones again. Will you let people know? And I'm like, absolutely, dude. So I put his email in here for you all. If you want to order cones, he makes really nice cones because cones can be a bit of a project to make. Yeah. In the class, we give you a link to the video of a guy who shows you how to do it the easiest way. But Jake makes really nice cones and polishes them and everything. It's just one of the things he likes to do. So I'm giving him a little plug here. Yay, Jake Engel. Maybe he's in this webinar listening to us. Oh, look at this equipment, right? So now we're taking the old time way and we're using modern equipment, right? So historical pharmacy style percolation, a little adapted to modern times. So they had instructions to do different herbs and different kinds of percolators even.
Yep.
Yeah, if you read like Remington's Practice of Pharmacy, 1880, whatever, 6 or something, he's like, for this herb or for this amount of this herb, use one of these percolators. They had basically 3 different kinds of just glass percolators, and then they had all these fancy percolator things that they had invented, right? But this is the classic percolation cone. And, it's a conical thing, right? They called this an ordinary percolator.
Okay.
Pack this much in an ordinary percolator. And what these come in different sizes. If you can get one, they're hard to find anymore. There's a place in Boulder, Colorado that will make them for you. It's called Allen Scientific Glass. Yeah. And we used to have like big, like 3-liter cones and 4-liter cones and things like that. I think this might be, is this a 2-liter? I think this is a 2-liter.
I think it was a
cone.
2-liter.
Yeah. So they come in different sizes. So they call that an ordinary percolator. And they're like, for most purposes, use an ordinary percolator. But they also had a thing called cylindrical percolators. And that is what the open top dropping funnel is similar to. Yeah, and they were like, for certain herbs, you want to use a cylindrical percolator, especially if you want to make a more concentrated tincture, blah, blah, blah. They got so specific with everything. They would even percolate in a big glass funnel. Do you ever see those apothecary funnels with the ridges inside? And you see a lot of those in antique stores for some reason or whatever, and they just go funnel, apothecary funnel, and I go percolator, because they actually would use those for like a quick and dirty percolation of small amounts of something of that sort. Yeah. Hey, Lynn, I see your hand is up.
Hey, so real quick though, if it's okay to ask a question, because I know Michael Moore, he was very specific about it needing to be cylindrical, and because the menstruum's going to touch more of the mark as it percolates down through. I've always wondered about the conical thing, like there's so much, the menstruum just isn't going to touch as much of the mark up at the wide part of the cone. Anyway, always wondered about that.
That's something they talked about that in the old books, right? And it's really interesting to read these things because, back in the day, before internet, TV, electricity, and all the things, they had a lot of time to sit down and think and talk about things, apparently. And there's a discussion that goes on in some of those books about that very point. And they say, the most efficient percolator is a cylindrical percolator. But the conical percolator is good enough for most purposes, because the menstruum does, get to everything in there. It just doesn't have the same length of travel path, right? In a conical percolator, your menstruum's going straight down. It has that long travel path. It's going through everything at the same, with the same efficient progression. With a conical percolator, it's going a little faster straight down through the middle and kind of slower down through the edges, but it still goes through, because when you take that mark out of there, it's wet. It's not dry around the edges, right? So maybe some of it moves sideways to some degree. The science of percolation is actually crazy complicated. We were looking at some like physics versions of that recently. So the menstruum will also kind of travel sideways a little bit and kind of slide down the sides. So it gets there. It's just not as 100% efficient as a cylindrical percolator. Yeah, pretty interesting stuff. They thought a lot about the shapes of percolators back in the day. So this something that's different with this equipment too, compared to the old time stuff, is we have stopcocks, right? They did not have there were some ground glass stopcocks back in the day, but for some reason they didn't use those a lot with percolators. What they did was they would plug it with cotton, right? There's cotton in there. You see, this one doesn't have a filter. They would put a little bit of cotton in there. Sometimes they would cover it with sand, right? And then they would put a rubber hose on the bottom, and they would like bend the hose and lower it and raise it on the principle of, what do they call that? The word's leaving my brain.
Oh,
Siphoning.
siphoning.
Yeah, and that's how they controlled the rate of dripping out of that percolator. Or sometimes they even said, this one blew my mind. I think I saw this in Remington's. They're like, if you pack the percolator just right, you don't even need a hose. You'll get it to drip at the right speed through the cotton. I'm like, whoa, there's some skill. There's some
That's skill.
developed art,
Yes.
right? So they would use that hose method, or they would use a notched cork, right? They would like cut like grooves in a cork in a certain way, so that if you put it in tight, it would stop the drip. But if you loosened it up a little bit, it would drip through the notches. That was another way they controlled drip rate. So they had, people were so clever.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
you gotta make it work without electricity and plastic, basically, because they didn't have plastic. But so today we have, with the Michael Moore method, you control the drip rate with bottle cap, right? How tight is it? How loose is it? But with these percolators, you get a stopcock just fused right onto it, and you can just turn it and control the drip rate really well.
Fine tune it.
Yeah. The disadvantage of that is you can break that off easy, so you have to be really careful with it.
True.
Some of these I've actually had like a little rubber hose at the bottom of the percolator, a little short piece, and then a stopcock attached to that. And you kind of wiggle around. That keeps you from breaking it. Yeah. So you got to be careful about that. But this totally takes away the need to put the coffee filter in there. And if you've ever like struggled with folding your filter properly, like we have, the cotton is a game changer. But we use organic cotton, right? And I talked to Donna about this. I'm like, did y'all ever use the cotton? Because it's in the old books. And they're like, we were kind of creeped out about the pesticides and stuff on cotton.
Fair enough.
Because they didn't have organic cotton balls when he came up with that. Yeah, but now we do. So now I'm like, cool, let's use that. It's way easier. The other thing that's different about this versus Michael Moore is you need stands to hold your percolators. You can't just set it in a jar, right? So this is a ring stand. They're not super expensive. I don't know, they cost like $40 or something. For your conical percolator, you need a ring stand. And for your cylindrical percolator, you need a stand with these things that are called 3-finger clamps with boss head. Boss head is the part that like fits onto the rod like this, right? So you do need some equipment, or you can make a wooden thing, for these guys, you can make a wooden holder to set them down in, which works really good too, but you can't set these in a wooden holder because they just fall through the hole. Right, so you kind of need that lab stand there. And this is, did we just do this last night? I think we just did this last night, didn't we?
Yes.
We decided to percolate dandelion root in the cylindrical, right, just to do something different. And we percolated the ginger root in the conical. Yeah, we haven't started dripping that one yet. We should start that when we get home, just to play with it. Conical, you can fit a lot more in. It doesn't look like it in this picture because of the camera angle, but this will hold a lot more material than this will. But these come in different sizes. But one other thing I wanted to share with you about this is that, is that the way, when you're doing percolations, you pre-moisten the herb, you pre-soak the herb, right?
Yes.
In like a bowl. And both Michael and Fenner said 12 to 24 hours, that moistening digestion step, right? Because it swells the herb and it helps dissolve the cell walls. It gets it ready for percolation extraction. But Fenner didn't pack it bit by bit like Michael taught to do, right? Fenner made it wetter in the moistening stage. And it's wetter than that damp sand consistency. And then he said, put it all in there at once, shake it down, and only pack it one time. And the first time I read that, I'm like, scary. Because I've always like, add a little packet, add a little packet. And you learn that way too,
That
right?
is how I learned it.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. But we tried it and it really worked.
I was surprised. Yeah.
But I think getting it a little wetter at first, using a little more menstruum to moisten at first is kind of key to that, because it makes it a little slightly soggy and heavy. And then you can dump it all in the percolator and just pack it once.
Yep.
Yeah. And so we did it with a few different herbs, and it's like amazing. Thanks, Spinner. So that's an example of the modern adaptations. Like you look at the old stuff and then you try it with your new equipment, and wow. I love that we're learning from 1800s pharmacists how to do this better. I think that's so cool. It's like tradition lives, right? So again, these are called open top dropping funnels. You can order them from Amazon.com, or you can order them from HBAR Sci. This one, I think this is a 500 mil.
That's
right?
500, yes.
Yeah, that costs like $40. That's the other thing. Like if you can get one of these, you're going to spend some money, like, I don't know, 150, $200, whatever they cost these days. These are only like $40. And you can get a kit with the stand for like $80, the stand and the clamps, right? So when I first learned that, I was like, whoa, okay. And they're common chemistry equipment. You know what I mean? So they're not hard to find like these conical percolators are. Yeah, pretty cool. Let's see what else we've got here. I know, question time. So this is comparing extraction methods. I'm gonna like fly through this. Sorry, I'm going over if you guys have to go somewhere. But there's a recording. Classical maceration time, it can take longer. It can take weeks, right? Agitation, you can only apply so much by shaking. Surface area, you can dial it in with surface area. You can powder it. You can use chunks, or you can shred it or whatever. So you think about the processes that you apply in the different methods, right? Here's me getting happy about a Vitamix. I'm like, this is fun. I think were we powdering Alea?
Oh, that
leaf?
is Alea.
Yeah,
Russian olive.
Elaeagnus, Russian olive leaf. It's the new green tea. It's the hotness. Vitamix maceration, your time is cut way down, right? Because you're using extreme agitation and a little bit of heat. And you can like totally powder, you can make great surface area inside of Vitamix, right? And then either do it right with the menstruum or put the menstruum on it right after you make the powder, if you want to do it that way. So Vitamix uses agitation to really cut down on time. When I talk about these things, I see like active sliders going up and down in my brain, like more agitation, less time, So with the home infusers or the power infusers or whatever with maceration, you can program your time, or you can use presets, right? So you can be like, hey, I think I want to do this for 2 hours or 1 hour or 4 hours or 8 hours, according to the matrix of the plant material and what you're up to. And you can just put that in there, and there it goes. I love these things. I love my kitchen power tools. And you can program the heat or use presets, right? And there's a whole science of how much heat should I use with different herbs. Are the constituents heat sensitive, blah, blah, blah. And it also does some agitation for you. So periodic automated agitation. With the Michael Moore method, dried herbs, you can make a really good tincture within hours, especially if you get the drip rate right. Not like what we did with that other ginger tincture that one time. And we had it, how long did it drip? 72 hours to drip it out. And I think there were like 60 grams, wasn't it? Yeah, we had a real slow dripper. That was a plug. That was an education. Right? So, but hours on this, so a lot of times people will make percolations because they need the tincture sooner and they don't know about the Vitamix, right? Or there isn't a Vitamix or electricity, right? You don't need electricity for this. That's cool. But you're using a coarse powder, so you got pretty good surface area. Gravity is doing a lot of your work for you, right? I was like thinking about gravity. Simple, affordable equipment, right? And then the 1800s pharmacy percolations, dried herbs, hours, they would specify the surface area, what I said, a powder size, right? They're just like, use this. And sometimes they would heat them, like with a water bath percolator. So they're taking different advantages of those extraction factors, right? And yeah, I was thinking about gravity with the percolation. It's like, oh, gravity is doing the work there of pulling that. I mean, is that a kind of agitation in a way?
Or a pressure?
It's like, how do we think about gravity? So that's my new thing I'm wondering over with gravity and percolation. But it's definitely gravity that's like,
right. You couldn't make that on a spaceship, I imagine, without gravity.
That would be such a mess.
Yeah.
Could you see
Tincture
it? Like,
everywhere.
you'd be up there with your percolators in the space station, like. That could be complicated. And with modern percolation, we have all of these things that we think about in advantages, but we're using easier equipment like our open tub dropping funnels. We have that advantage of being able to control that drip rate really easily. Yeah. Yeehaw! Hey, I'm only 26 minutes over. That's about characteristic. So yeah, this is the kind of things we do if there's folks out there who haven't taken a class with us before. This is what we do. Here's the website where you can go and see the online classes that we have and just different stuff and learn more about these things. And this is our new class that we're like opening to y'all tonight with special early bird discounts. We're so excited. We've been working on this like crazy women
Yes.
for so long because we just got deeply into it. I think we thought we
Fun.
were making a shorter class,
Mhm.
and it was just so interesting that we ended up making this really like extensive class. And then in the course of that, when we got into that menstruum math thing, we were like, we should have a calculator for this. So we got the calculator programmed and included that in the class. And it's different. Some of you might have our elixir calculator, our elixir and tinctures calculator. That's a different calculator. We decided instead of selling the calculator separately to put it in this class, right? So if you signed up for this webinar, you're going to get an email afterwards that has the link to the recording in case you didn't make it or you just want to look at it again or whatever. And it'll also show you where you can go to check out that class if you're interested in that. And I decided to put that link on here as well. I mean, is everybody like copying it down? You can take a picture with your phone, but also you're going to get a recording. So you'll have that in front of you. Wow, time for questions.
Yay.
I know there's so much to say about this. It's like, yeah, one of those things. All right, so I'm going to stop my screen share and throw up your hands. And then you can actually ask your question live and in person, and we're going to answer it. And the first hand I see
raise their
is
hand.
the first one that's going to go. There we
Amy.
go. Amy. I'm unmuting. I'm asking you to unmute, Amy.
Hey, that worked.
Yes.
This was
Hey.
really interesting. Thank you very
Yes.
much. Thank you, thank you. So what do you guys think about glycerites and using glycerin instead of alcohol, especially like for kids or for people that can't have alcohol?
Yeah, every different menstruum and every different method has its place, right? So one of the things that I like to repeat is it's like people be like, what's the best way to do this herb? What's the best way? And some very wise man, probably Paul Bergner, said to me, it's the way that they're going to take. Because if they're not going to take that amazing medicine you made, it's worthless to them. And I was like, oh, right. So, you know, compliance, right? If you're not going to take it, it's no good. So there's that factor to consider, because sometimes tinctures taste awful to, you know, kids or elders or people who like sweet things or whatever. And sometimes you got to think with animals too, right? It's like, do not give alcohol tinctures to dogs and cats, especially cats. It's ugly. I made that mistake once in my life. I'll never do it again. But the other thing about glycerites is think about polarity, right? Think about that relative polarity thing. Ethanol 65, glycerin 81, water 100. Glycerin is like water. So glycerin goes after the more water soluble or higher polarity constituents from an herb. So it is going to be pulling a different range of constituents out of an herb than your hydroethanolic solvent will, right? So it's not going to be the same as a hydroethanolic tincture. It'll be a little different. So if you're cool with having higher polarity constituents in your tincture, right, then the glycerin is a good way to do it. You can also influence that with heat and time and agitation. You can get that glycerin to pick up some things that it might not want to so much because of the polarity. You can kind of encourage it to pick those up by using heat and time and agitation. So you can make a stronger glycerite. I made a ginger glycerite recently, right? Because I was like, I got some sample from somewhere for some project, formulation project, and I was like, this isn't very gingery. I bet I could make a better one. And that's how I did it. I did heat and agitation over time. And I picked up a lot of that ginger like character because the pungent constituents in ginger are kind of resinous. They like, mid to higher percent ethanol. But I got a significant amount to come out in that glycerin by doing that. So that's how you think. If you need to use a glycerite, you got to realize what the polarity of glycerin is, what it's naturally going to want to get, and then how can you encourage it to get some more of those lower polarity constituents if that's what you want from certain herbs by using heat and time and agitation.
Yep. Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I also forgot to ask about the shelf life of a glycerite or even a tincture. I think a tincture lasts forever. Does a glycerite last forever?
Yeah, if you're super clean with them, they usually have a really good shelf life with the glycerin, but not as long as ethanol. I talked to somebody one time who did lab analysis for what do you call it, micro. When you go after the microbiology, you're looking for organisms in the glycerin. And they were like, yeah, you'd be surprised. There are quite a few more organisms, microbes that can survive in glycerin than a lot of people think. So it's a pretty good preservative in some situations, especially if it doesn't have too much water in it, because if you get more water, you get more microbial growth. If you have enough, if you're using straight up glycerin and it's not a super watery plant, then you're usually pretty good. But ethanol definitely kills microorganisms better than glycerin does. So it's a kind of, everything's a range, everything's a spectrum, right? Yeah, so if you want to make it last longer, keep it in the fridge.
That's what I was
Right?
thinking. Yes.
Yeah, because cold always retards microbial growth. But just don't let them sit in the sun and get hot or whatever. And another thing, I gotta say this is kind of related to your question, is don't store tinctures in dropper top bottles. Right? I learned about this from Ryan Drum. Right? Because he's like, have you ever tasted that rubbery taste in a tincture that's old, that's been stored in a dropper bottle? He's like, that's called butyl rubber and it's toxic. And as soon as he said that, I was like, ooh. He said, ethanol fumes will go up there and dissolve that and it'll get into your tincture. So what we store in these
polycone caps.
Yeah, they're way more inert than dropper tops. Although the white ones are better than the black ones because it's a different kind of rubber, but still for storage. You just made me think of that. Okay, let's do the next question. Yep, Eleonora.
Hello, I'm from the Netherlands, by the way. It's nighttime for me.
Oh my goodness, you are up. Respect.
Well, it's really interesting, so it's worth it. My question is, can you make a full spectrum tincture by using different ethanol percentage and then combine it together to start with water and then build it up with little steps of ethanol? So to take out every compound.
You can get close, right? So the idea of full spectrum, it's like, honestly, full spectrum is kind of a marketing word. And so is broad spectrum in a way, but there's reality to it as well, right? So if you look at any given herb, it's going to have a whole range of constituents in it, and they're going to have a range of polarity and a range of solubilities, right? So here's a hypothetical thing. Say I've got, I'm just talking about ginger because ginger possesses us. You could do ginger 20%, 30%, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90%. You could do all that stuff. And then a thing you might want to know when you mix them together is what ethanol percent is it in the end, right? So you can calculate all that out. That's a fun one. But you might get some precipitation, which means, the polarity, when you mix all of those different ones together, the polarity is going to be somewhere in the middle. And the constituents that liked the 10%, which means 90% water, did I say 10%? The constituents that like the 20% menstruum, which is 80% water, they're not going to like the 90% menstruum as much, right? So you're going to be like bringing that polarity range together when you mix all those things in. You might lose some of the highest polarity constituents and you might lose some of the lower polarity constituents. They might precipitate out. You know what I mean? That's the only thing that could happen. If you're cool with shake well before using, you're still going to get those constituents. The problem with that is if your clients or your customers expect a clear tincture, like in the United States, people don't want to see stuff floating around in their tincture because they think it's some kind of dangerous schmutz or whatever. If you shake it, you're still going to get those constituents, but you could get precipitation, and that could be an issue in certain instances, right? Where did she just disappeared? Okay,
Yeah.
we'll take
How about Lana?
next.
Lana Smith.
This is fun. I love questions.
I know you do.
Oh, hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lana.
Hi, Lisa. I know you can't. I've done a lot of classes with you before. How are you?
Awesome. Having
Can you-
Nice
fun.
name.
Oh, this is great. Okay. Eleanor was just asking a question about, I wasn't sure whether I got her question right, and I wasn't even going to ask this one because I have a different one. But when I do decoctions and then also perk the herb after I wring it out, I will perk it with alcohol
Mhm,
and then I add them together
mhm.
to pull out both constituents. And then I mix it in a ratios because I use the alligation method, the pharmaceutical alligation method of math,
I don't know what that is.
which is probably the same as what you're doing. It's like a tic-tac-toe thing, and you do higher and lower or zero, whatever, and it tells you exactly what you have to add in the way of how many parts of alcohol to how many parts of your.
Might be a
It's
different way to do
allegation
what we
method.
do.
Cool. We'll look it up.
Yeah, we'll
I
look
think
into
they
that.
do it
That
in
sounds
pharma-
interesting.
They do it. I wanted to make sure it was the same thing as your formulas. If I'm doing
I
it
don't
right,
know.
that's what
I was like, I love this. The one reason I love questions is because people ask me questions I can't answer, and I'm like, I need to learn a new thing.
Yep.
they use it in They use it in pharmaceuticals,
Interesting.
in medications for people, in drips or injections or.
Yeah.
So it should be right. Just look
Kind
it
of
up and
like
see if.
solution chemistry or something, right? Like solution concentration chemistry and stuff.
Yeah,
which
like
is-
if you have 10% of this and you needed to add 20% of something to make
yeah,
something for an injection,
right.
say in the medical world or whatever,
Yeah.
or a drip, IV drip,
Mhm.
then they use the allegation method.
Yeah, I
to-
think what we're doing, what the relationship may be between what we're doing and that is we're doing like the version of it that applies to botanical tincturing. You know, I think we are doing a version of that.
That's what I'm wondering. I think so too. And maybe
Yeah.
yours is a lot easier than having to go through it's
Yeah.
become easy
because
I've been using it.
that allocation, is that what you call it?
Allegation.
Allocation.
Allegation.
Allegation method,
ALLIGA.
that's probably more precise, right? Because you have to be more precise with pharmaceuticals because
It's
they're
exact.
so
It's supposed to
concentrated
be
and
exact,
potent.
yeah.
Yeah, so this
So it
is
gives me the right amount of alcohol to,
right.
and I can put in, you get to put in exactly what end percentage you want your product to be,
Yeah,
like 22%, 25, 19, whatever,
okay.
I'm hoping, I think I'm anyway, and then about the, so I wanted to see, is that about the same thing you're doing, but taking the formula and not having to do the first part of it or something,
Yeah, I think so. Like
making movements like you can see me.
And I can't see.
I'm
you.
using my hands like you guys can see me. I can't see you. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things that the historical pharmacists learned, they would probably know exactly what you're talking about because you know, we don't use as much chemistry and math calculations as they did actually in our modern medicine making, but we don't have to, because generally speaking, we're not working with potentially toxic herbs. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
it's okay if we wiggle off a little bit with most of these. For all practical purposes, it doesn't really matter.
Well, I go down rabbit holes with things
Yeah.
like that.
Oh,
Then I
yeah.
get all this math stuff going, you know, I go nuts. Anyway, one of the questions I had was, oh, all the, there's a lot of stuff in some of my things because they're decoctions and tinctures.
Mhm.
I don't like to empty it because it doesn't look like actual precipitate. I mean, you have to shake it, right?
Mhm.
That's what you were telling her.
Yeah,
I
there's
leave
two
that
things. So there's two things that you could have. You could have precipitated constituents, and you can also
Yeah.
have like insoluble stuff. So the
Yeah.
insoluble stuff that falls down to the bottom is like cellulose and cell wall material and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it except maybe aesthetically if you're looking for a clear product, but it's fiber
But
basically.
but the insoluble stuff, would that become clear when you shake it? It wouldn't, would it?
No, it's just going to
No,
be
so it's
fine
not
particulate.
insoluble stuff in there. Because if I shake it and then pour it, it's clear. You know,
Well,
not
I mean,
clear because there's
it's distributed, you know, but it's still there.
yeah, distributed.
Particulate. Yeah. Let's take another question. We have
Yeah,
a bunch of people with their hands up.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No
Okay,
worries.
thanks, Lisa. Thanks so much for
You're
this class.
welcome. Who's next?
JC Bug.
JC
I've asked
Bug.
to
What a
unmute.
cool name. Where'd it go? Hello.
There it is.
JC Bug, where are you? Are you there?
There.
There we are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes? Great. Thank you. Hi. I was wondering about the heat. How do you know what temperature to use and for what length of time? And also, with the home products, like how do you know what temperature to put these things on?
Yeah. So there's a rule of thumb, right? And the way first, when we were first like discussing how much temperature setting and how long to do these for, we're like, okay, what's the historical precedent? And we went and we looked in Fenner's formulary. This is what I do with Michelle, my pharmacist friend, who like did that first calendula percolation when we
Yes.
got the machine.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah. So, you know, I went over this with a pharmacist and we're like kicking it back and forth, kicking about all the angles. And we're like, let's go see what the old timers did. So we went through a bunch of old books. And what we found was that they actually did heat a lot of herbs during the percolations, right? So Fenner invented this thing, like we mentioned earlier, called the water bath percolator, right? And it is so interesting. Like he didn't give, at least in the works that we found, maybe in his technical like secret, you know, because he did have an herbal production business also, or drug house. He probably had it, you know, proprietary information, but for the public, he didn't do heat in degrees. He did like heat it moderately, heat it strongly, heat it gently. You know, he had these kind of categories of heating, and he would heat a lot of things to what he called moderately for quite a few hours, interestingly, in the water bath percolator, like at, you know, 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of applying, you know, I know what he meant by heating it moderately. And we kind of cross-referenced a bunch of books. And, you know, it seemed like it was somewhere in the range of 120 to 140 Fahrenheit that he was doing. And he, with that water bath, he was doing it for like 8 hours or more with different herbs. And we thought about that for a while. And I was like kind of surprised by it at first, right?
Seem high.
Yeah. And then we thought about what John Uri Lloyd was doing, right? Because he was like the master eclectic pharmacist. That guy was, you know, and he had all these different kinds of heated extractors. So I think today we're a little shyer about applying heat to things than those guys were. And the other thing is, I studied a lot about heating honey because I do honey extractions. I work with honey companies. And you know, a lot of people are like, don't heat the honey, you'll ruin it. And heat is a spectrum, right? Heat isn't a one thing like no heat good, any heat bad. Heat is a spectrum, and the effects it's going to have are a spectrum. So we figured out from all this scientific stuff that if you heat honey to like 120 degrees Fahrenheit, you get a really good extraction. You can use the honey as an extraction fluid, but you don't damage the honey. And you don't produce like certain molecules that you'll produce if you overheat it for too long that are undesirable, right? So I thought about the honey and excuse me, I gotta hit the water bottle here. I thought about the honey, and I thought about biological constituents, and I thought about the ethanol, and I'm like, 120 seems like a nice amount of heat. 130, that's a pretty good amount of heat,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
you know, and but it also matters how much time you apply the heat for, right?
Right.
But you know, when you make a decoction, you're applying some heat, right? If you're simmering it, you're getting close to the, you know, boiling point of water, and you're doing it for hours, you know.
Mm.
But then the other thing, the other answer to the equation is some constituents are more heat sensitive than others, right? So there's
Right.
not like a one size fits all with that too. Some constituents are really quite heat stable. So it depends on the plant. It depends on the constituents you're after to some degree as well. Yeah.
So
but
is it just a matter of research then that you did to find out which herb worked with what temperature?
Yeah, I mean, what we came up with, the thing that works with most herbs that we've tried so far, and it seems to work really well, is about 120 for about 4 to 8 hours in those extractors.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can play
Fabulous.
with any individual herb, and like, you know, hypothetically, with every herb, there is the optimal point at which to do all of these processes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it just
Yeah.
depends on.
Well, I'm not there in any way. I'm not there yet. So, but I just found that was really fascinating because, yeah, we're taught, you know, not to heat, right? Not to use heat with
Yeah.
herbs. So it's fabulous. Thank you so much. That's really
Yeah.
cool.
Absolutely. And one closing remark on that, think about what they do in Chinese medicine. Boy, they boil stuff. You know what I mean? Like some of those,
Yeah.
like, they give you that wonderful package and they're like, boil this for these hours. And like, oh, I mean,
Right.
Chinese pharmacy is really dialed in. So, you know, appropriate amounts of heat for appropriate time, different for different herbs. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks, you guys. Awesome.
Yep.
Natalie?
Natalie. Hello,
Hi.
Natalie.
Evening.
Hey.
Hi. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me get onto camera here. Anyway, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I'm very
welcome.
So I had a question also about the heat and about the machines, the magical butter machine and also the SCS machine. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that information.
So magicalbuttermachine.com, I think. And the other one is STX is the company, and it's STX Infusium.
420.
420 because they made it for cannabis, but it works totally fine for any herb, right? Those are the two. You can just order them from various places online. Yeah.
Okay. And so when let's say I get the machines, so I will, currently I am heating herbs about 100, between 100 and 140, depending, for 48 hours. Is that I'm doing it in my crock pot.
Cool.
And I've put in the temperature in the crock pot, and that's how I know.
Yeah.
So is that too much? And can I transfer that same technology to those machines? What do you think?
Yeah, is it too much? Probably not, but it depends on the herb. Like some herbs are some herbs have heat sensitive, excuse me, constituents.
Okay.
Like feverfew, for example, like everybody's like raw feverfew leaves are where it's at, you know? So it does depend to some degree on the herb, and you kind of have to have a sense of which constituents are in there. The other thing is you can drive off volatile constituents, right? By heating. And so, you know, if you do that in a crock pot, you put a lid on it, while you're doing that? Yeah. So, you know, but the lid doesn't seal as tightly as these machines do. So that might be a little advantage to keep some of your volatiles or your essential oil constituents in better with a more closed container, right? You can, you know, control your heat even more with these because you set it, and it does stir for you, which is an advantage, right? So that kind of increases your extraction to some degree too. But like that's I used to do stuff in a crock pot. I have not done it in a, I don't know if this is okay, in a, what do they call those new pressure cooker things? Instant pot. But I know some people who do decoctions in instant. I've done a decoction in an instant pot, but not a tincture.
Yeah.
I correct that. Decoction in an Instant Pot is amazing. It makes great decoctions, but it's using the principle of pressure,
Heat.
right? It's not doing agitation, it's doing heat and pressure, which is super interesting. But yeah, you can pretty much anything that you would do in a crock pot, you could do in one of these infusion machines. And also it's set it and forget it, and it stirs for you. So you don't have to worry about, you know, keeping your temperature just right and scorching and all those things. But, you know, 140, I would say, is at kind of the higher end of what I do with stuff. Other people maybe would be like, haha, that's not hot, you know, if they're used to really, you know, using more heat with their herbs. I generally stay in that 120 to 130 range just based on, you know, what I've learned about extrapolating what I've learned about working with constituents in honey, which is different, granted. I might be a little cautious with my heat, you know, and stay lower, but you also get the added agitation. So that kind of makes it, yeah. So if you made something at 140 with your crock pot and you really liked it, the experiment would be do it at 130 in the machine, because you'll also have the agitation and then compare them and see what you think.
Okay, so that leads me to another question about RPMs. I was researching like a laboratory stir machine. And then you're talking about the Vitamix, and now we're talking about this. And obviously the RPMs make friction, which is an additional component of heat. So what should I consider with regard to RPMs?
Yeah, number one, Vitamix, total RPM queen, right? And that's why when you run it for a while, it starts to warm up. That's where that heat is coming from. It's coming from the friction of those high RPM blades, right? But it doesn't, you don't have to extract long enough to make it too hot with the Vitamix. Yeah, you can do it for a short period. What I tell people is if it feels like a hot bath on the outside, that's about when you want to stop.
Okay. About
Sometimes.
30 minutes, then you say 20 to 30 minutes at that point.
No, I'm talking 5 minutes.
Oh, wow.
In a Vitamix. It's wacky. That's why I'm obsessed with Vitamixes. People are like, those things are expensive. Do I really need one? And I'm like, no, but they're the best at what they do. You know, get a used one on eBay or Craigslist. That's what I do. Yeah, we've been through some Vitamixes. But yeah, it doesn't take long to heat up with just from the friction with that Vitamix, because the RPM is so high, right? So you know, 5 minutes, sometimes I'll do 5 minutes and I'll let it cool room temperature, and I'll do another 5 minutes if I really want to do a thorough extraction, right? With the infuser machines, the RPM is not nearly as high, but they're heat controlled. So they have a temperature probe and they do feedback. So they'll keep it at that temperature that you set, right? So you don't have to worry about overheating in them either, which is cool. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Welcome. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna stop at 8 because that's a half an hour over, because I took a half an hour extra. So let's take another one.
Edna, I have asked you to unmute.
Edna.
Yeah, hi. Hey, thanks, Lisa. This is great.
Cool.
So many things. I do have a Vitamix. I also have this contraption that's a soy milk maker, and I just looked it up. It gets to be like 200 degrees inside. Is that too hot for anything?
I would have to, think about that before doing it. I mean,
Right.
I
Okay,
think
cool.
some herbs you could probably get away with that, but some herbs might not like that.
Yeah.
And that's like hot for
Yeah.
ethanol too. Like ethanol, what's the Fahrenheit boiling point? Is it 178 Fahrenheit?
Yeah.
Fahrenheit?
I was actually thinking about glycerin. I need to
Mhm.
make some soothing throat cough things for elderly. So
Mhm.
your talk about glycerin where you said heat,
Right.
would you do straight glycerin with dried powdered herbs in the Vitamix, maybe?
I haven't done that, but that's an interesting idea because it's kind of like making a electuary in a way where you like powder herbs and put them in honey. I have mixed powdered herbs into honey, but I haven't done it in a Vitamix.
What about mixing glycerin and honey?
You can do that.
Would you leave out any water aqueous component?
I would,
Yeah.
because when you add the water, you're increasing the water activity and you're making more microbial growth.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, so have you ever extracted any frankincense, boswellia?
Have I ever extracted it?
Yeah.
No, actually.
Okay.
I don't use frankincense and boswellia anymore because it's endangered.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing herb, but there are other amazing herbs that I use instead, but I stopped using that.
Huh.
Yeah.
All right. I thank you so much. I'd love to connect with you some more. Thank you.
Yeah. Now you gave me some ideas there. It's like, oh, let's try that in the Vitamix.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, next is Terry.
Okay, we'll take Terry.
Oh my God, you're so much fun. I've been cracking up all night.
Yay.
Love your energy, your enthusiasm. It's thrilling.
Aw.
I'm from the Vancouver Island. My question is around the mark after the percolation. I make a brew with it after perking it. And it's like, I'm thinking I'm making a tea after it's being percolated, but what's your experience and what do you think about that?
Wow, that's interesting. Have we ever done that?
No, we haven't.
I don't think we've done that,
yeah.
but I can go on. Yeah, so it depends, think about, higher polarity constituents in water, right? And lower polarity constituents in ethanol. The first thing I would think about is what menstruum did I percolate with, right? Yeah. Was it a lower percent ethanol? Was it a higher percent? Because if it was higher percent ethanol that I percolated with, then some of those water solubles are still going to be in there more so than the lower polarity constituents, which came out, right? So, but if I perked with a lower polarity menstruum, then I probably got, a lot of the lower polarity constituents out. So I would expect my tea to be weaker in those. Yeah. That's interesting though. You get something out by doing that, right?
Just trying to upcycle. I hate waste and I don't want to compost. So yeah.
That's interesting. Another thing you can do is you can actually press that mark, which we have done. Mm-hmm. You can take it out and, put it in whatever you used to press. Like hallelujah, we finally got a real tincture press, like one of those mighty strictly medicinals tincture presses. And just for fun, we pressed the mark. Did you do that while I was out of town or something?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. And how much more did you get?
Oh, I got almost 100 milliliters. It was a lot.
Yeah.
Out of it was a surprising amount. It seemed diluted, however, there was still
because a lot of the constituents have been extracted already. I remember it was very pale compared to the actual tincture we collected.
Right.
But the old timers used to do that because they would have huge percolators, right? And they would make they made a lot of percolated tincture because it was the medicine back then, and they would sell it to all the physicians and everything. So they had gigantic percolators. And when you think about how much menstruum is retained in those percolators, like that became economically significant. So they would take all of that huge amount of mark and they would put it in big old mechanical presses and squeeze it out. And then they would either concentrate it by distillation to get a usable tincture again, or they would filter it through like charcoal and different stuff to get clean alcohol or clean menstruum out again. And they would find ways to reuse it. Yeah.
Love it. So cool. I just use my potato press masher to help push out the extra of the mark.
Yeah.
Did you get? I'm gonna save up to get these equipments, and I'm thrilled. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And I said I was going to stop at 8, but there's one more hand up, and you've been waiting so patiently.
Let's see.
So
Terry?
yeah,
it's,
let's just get Terry and then we'll stop. Oh,
Or no, it's Amy actually.
Amy. Oh, there's more than one more hand. Oh, I hate stopping before.
There we go. So, hi, everybody. Thank you very much for taking my question. I'm out here in Hawaii, so we're going all over the world here. My question is using a sous vide for tincturing as a water bath, which is ultra controllable in terms of its temperature. I'm a former chef, so that's how I got into herbalism. So,
wow. We've never done it. So in every webinar we do, somebody brings this up. They're like, what about using a sous vide? And I'm like, I have zero knowledge about that.
they're super controllable. They're a beautiful water bath. You put all of your herb and mark in your immense room into a sealed bag and then drop it into a beautiful hot water bath. It's ultimately controllable for as long as you want it to.
Wow. We should get one.
Yes, I've written it down.
Yeah.
It's on the
And you'll
list.
stir the water for you
Okay.
so it keeps it going. So yeah, just another thing to think about.
All
Thanks.
right. Who's
Thank
this
you.
person who's been waiting with her hand up? Gloria has been waiting forever. Let's get Gloria. Hi, Gloria.
Hi, how are you?
Hey.
So much. I love this. I love this so much. I'm having so much.
Yay.
My question is, I know you went over the glycerides and how they should be refrigerated. However, I live in Miami. I did not refrigerate. It's my first time doing experiments with herb, making tinctures and stuff. So it's been about 75 degrees. And I've had them in the glass mason jars. How long can they be here in the glass mason? Well, now I know I'm going to put it in the refrigerator, but how soon do I need to put it in a cobalt bottle?
You mean like how long do you leave the herb in it before you bottle
No,
it?
like I did these in August, and I've already strained them.
Oh, okay. They're already
They're like this already.
yeah. So there's not a single answer to that, right? But I mean, because it depends on how clean everything was when you made them, right? Like, or what kind of organisms were just floating through the air or whatever, right? So, but generally speaking, glycerites last okay as long as they can actually grow mold on the top too. Sometimes I've seen that. But generally speaking, if there's not a lot of water in them, I mean, they're gonna be fine for like, ish, like 2 or 3 years, as long as you don't get them in ultraviolet or, but some people will extract fresh plants with glycerin and then there's a lot more water in it and then it has a lot more chance to go off. But, I think they're probably fine as long as they don't look or smell funky. And, most people don't keep their glycerites in the fridge, but I'm kind of like a refrigerator nut and I keep a lot of stuff in the fridge that most people don't keep in the fridge.
Oh, okay. Because it's the hard cover. So with these covers, if it turns a little, does it mean it's bad? The lid? Like it gets a little dark?
Not necessarily. I mean, with stuff like that, my ultimate judgment is, does it smell funny? Does it taste funny?
Okay. All right.
Unless you have analytical equipment or you can do microbial analysis or whatever. So, yeah, there was one more person that's
Thank you.
I think they just dropped their hand,
Oh, did they
actually.
leave? Okay, do we don't have anybody else?
Edna, Terry, yeah.
We
That's
good?
everything.
Okay, thank you everybody so much. It's been so much fun sharing this stuff with you.